Welcome to Void of Rules, where nightmares have no boundaries. In this channel, we explore the darkest corners of horror that most dare not enter. Every video takes you deeper into the shadows where forgotten terrors wait. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers by year's end. The void hungers for new souls. And now, let's dive into the void. I need the money. That's what I kept telling myself when I accepted the job at the Majestic cinema. As a broke college student drowning in textbook costs and ramen dinners, the night shift position seemed perfect. Flexible hours that worked around my class schedule, free movies, and decent pay for what appeared to be simple work. If only I'd known what lurked behind those ornate theatre doors. My name is Daniel Everett, 20 years old and majoring in film studies at Westlake University. The irony isn't lost on me. A film student working at possibly the most haunted cinema in America. Before all this started, I had dreams of becoming a director, of telling stories that would captivate audiences. Now I'm trapped in a nightmare, forced to show films that should never see the light of day. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. The Majestic isn't like those modern multiplexes with their digital projectors and neon-lit lobbies. It's an old single-screen theatre from the 1920s, nestled at the edge of town where the streetlights grow dim and fog tends to linger regardless of the weather. The building itself is an architectural relic, copper-domed roof topped with a weather-worn statue of a robed woman holding what was once a torch, now just a jagged stump. The marquee still uses actual letters that have to be changed manually, and the lobby features faded crimson wallpaper with intricate golden patterns that seem to shift when viewed from different angles. I remember the first time I laid eyes on the Majestic. It was a particularly gloomy October evening, rainwater streaming down the worn limestone facade like tears. Despite its state of disrepair, there was something undeniably magnetic about the place. The ticket booth was a hexagonal island of brass and clouded glass, sitting in a small courtyard before the main entrance. Above the grand double doors, an ornate carving depicted a scene I couldn't quite decipher. Figures gathered around what appeared to be an altar or perhaps a stage. Unlike the modern theatres scattered throughout the city centre, the Majestic stood alone, surrounded by an overgrown lot where weeds pushed through cracked concrete. The nearest buildings were abandoned storefronts that had gone out of business years ago. I would later learn that no business could thrive in the Majestic's shadow, not because of economic factors, but because of something else entirely. What struck me most was how the building seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even on that first evening, I noticed how the street lamps nearby appeared dimmer, their illumination somehow swallowed by the theatre's presence. I dismissed it as atmospheric pollution, or perhaps just my imagination running wild after watching too many horror films. My interview with Mr. Harrington, the theatre manager, was brief but memorable. He's tall and gaunt, with skin so pale it appears almost translucent in certain lighting. His eyes are deep-set but surprisingly bright, and he always wears pristine white gloves, even when handling the ancient cash register or sorting through dusty film reels. His questions were odd, not about my experience or availability, but whether I was sensitive to atmospheric fluctuations or if I'd ever experienced temporal displacement. I laughed nervously and said no, assuming these were just the eccentricities of an old man who'd spent too much time in the dark. He hired me on the spot. The Majestic selects its own staff, he said cryptically, sliding a weathered leather-bound book across his desk. These are your guidelines. Learn them. Follow them without exception. Mr. Harrington's office itself was as strange as its occupant. Located behind the concession stand, through a door marked management only, it was far larger than the exterior dimensions of that section of the building would suggest. The walls were lined with film canisters, some so old they were made of wood rather than metal. His desk was an imposing mahogany piece that must have weighed several £100, carved with scenes of audience members, watching a screen where indistinct shapes performed unsettling acts. The overhead light flickered constantly, creating a strobe effect that made Mr. Harrington occasionally appear to be in two places at once. On one wall hung framed photographs of the Majestic throughout different eras: the grand opening in 1927, renovations in 1958, and various special events. The same tall, thin figure stood in the background of each photo, Mr. Harrington, looking precisely as he did sitting across from me. "You have an interest in film, I understand," he said, his voice like two tones playing simultaneously, one deep, one slightly higher. The Majestic has shown many films over the years, some that never existed anywhere else. "I'm studying film history and production," I replied, trying to maintain eye contact despite the disconcerting way his pupils seemed to expand and contract independent of the light. "Excellent. Then you understand the power of images in sequence, how they can change a person." His gloved fingers tapped rhythmically on the guidebook. "This theatre has its own history, its own rules. Some may seem arbitrary, even foolish. I assure you they are not." The temperature in the room dropped suddenly. I could see my breath clouding before me, though Mr. Harrington's breath remained invisible. "Do you believe in things beyond rational explanation, Mr. Everett?" I hesitated. "I'm open to possibilities." A smile spread across his face that was too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous. "Good, very good. The Majestic requires an open mind and a degree of adaptability." The book's cover was unmarked except for a faded gold emblem that resembled a projector beam. Inside, the pages were yellowed, filled with rules written in various handwriting styles, some dating back decades based on the ink fading and paper quality. The paper itself felt wrong somehow, too soft in some places, too rigid in others, as if it wasn't quite paper at all, but something merely pretending to be. I spent my first evening after the interview reading through the guidelines by lamplight in my small apartment. Rain tapped against the windows as I turned each page carefully, some so brittle they threatened to crumble at my touch. A strange odour emanated from the book, not the expected mustiness of old paper, but something sweeter and more metallic, like copper and honeysuckle. The first set of rules seemed perfectly reasonable for a century-old theatre. Always wear the complete uniform, including the distinctive crimson vest and black tie. Theatre doors must be locked precisely at 11:45 p.m, not a minute before or after. No patrons allowed into screenings after the third preview has begun. If the temperature drops suddenly in the lobby, check Theatre 4 immediately. Never allow single patrons to sit in the back row of Theatre 1 on Sunday evenings. Empty seats in row J must remain empty during all showings between sunset and midnight. When checking theatres after closing, always move clockwise through the building. The spotlight in the south corner must remain unplugged, except during special events. If you hear knocking from inside the walls, ignore it completely. Red candies in the concession stand must be removed before each night's final showing. The mirrors in the bathrooms must be cleaned with the special solution in the supply closet, never with commercial glass cleaner. Count all ticket stubs twice before disposal. I remember wondering about many of these rules. Why keep seats empty when the theatre could sell them? Why move clockwise through the building during checks? Why were red candies specifically problematic for the final showing? But I figured these had reasonable explanations. Viewing angles, efficient movement patterns, perhaps red dye might stain in the dimmer evening lighting. As I continued reading, the handwriting changed dramatically around page 17, becoming more urgent. The letters pressed deeply into the paper as if carved, rather than written. If an audience member appears to flicker when the projector light passes through them, notify management immediately, but do not approach them. Crying heard from empty theatres should be logged in the incident book, with exact time and duration. The door marked exit at the rear of Theatre 2 does not lead outside. Keep it locked at all times. If you smell burning hair during a showing, evacuate quietly and methodically. These seemed less like standard operating procedures and more like warnings. I convinced myself they were just the accumulated superstitions of decades of theatrical employees, perhaps even inside jokes or hazing for new staff members. How terribly wrong I was. My first day was orientation learning the ancient cash register, with its stiff keys that sometimes moved on their own, memorizing the location of supplies and being fitted for my uniform. The crimson vest felt oddly warm against my skin, as if it retained body heat from the previous wearer. The fabric itself was peculiar, a deep, rich red that seemed to shift and swirl when viewed from the corner of my eye, with gold buttons that were ice cold to the touch. "This has been worn by many ushers before you," said Vivian, the usher training me. She was a petite woman, perhaps in her 30s, with a tight bun of dark hair and eyes that never seemed to blink in unison. "The vest chooses its wearer as much as you choose to wear it." I laughed at what I thought was a joke. Vivian didn't laugh with me. The first week passed relatively uneventfully. The job wasn't difficult. I tore tickets, directed patrons to their seats, occasionally swept up popcorn between showings, and helped close up at night. The Majestic primarily showed art house films and classics, attracting a clientele that seemed as antiquated as the venue itself. Many regulars dressed formally, as if attending a premiere rather than a Monday evening screening of a foreign film from the 1960s. I did notice a few oddities even in that first week. Patrons who entered theatres but never exited. Brief moments when the air grew so cold my fingers would ache. Shadows that moved against the direction of the light casting them. Once, while cleaning Theatre 3 after a showing of Nosferatu, I found a single shoe in the front row. A child's Mary Jane, at least 50 years out of fashion, that was filled with what appeared to be fresh soil. When I brought it to Mr. Harrington, he took it with a gloved hand and nodded knowingly. "The past sometimes leaves tokens in the present," he said cryptically, placing the shoe in a cabinet behind his desk that was filled with similar, seemingly random items. A doll missing its eyes, a pocket watch frozen at 3:33, a movie ticket dated 1947 that appeared to have been printed just moments ago. It was during my second week that I began noticing more significant things. The subtle became unmistakable. The other ushers, there were only 3 others besides me, had peculiar habits that became impossible to ignore. Thomas, who'd been there longest, always walked backward when exiting Theatre 3. He was a tall, lanky man with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and fingers that seemed too long for his hands. His eyes were different colours, one brown, one a pale blue that almost appeared white under certain lighting. "It's bad luck to turn your back on Theatre 3 as you leave," he told me when he caught me watching him. "Something might follow you out." Vivian would count her steps under her breath when crossing the lobby after 9 p.m. I noticed she would sometimes restart her count if interrupted, becoming visibly distressed until she could resume from the beginning. Once, when the power flickered momentarily, she froze mid-step and mid-count, her face contorting in terror until the light stabilized. Parker, the youngest besides me, at perhaps 25, would pause at each doorway, knocking 3 times before passing through. He had an unsettling habit of staring at the empty corners of rooms as if watching something move across them. His hands trembled constantly except when he was changing the marquee letters, a task he performed with mechanical precision. "They get restless if the letters aren't perfectly aligned," he explained when I offered to help once. "The words have to be exactly right, or they might change overnight into something else, something that attracts the wrong sort of audience." When I asked directly about these strange behaviours, they all gave variations of the same answer. It's in the guidelines. But I'd read the guidelines thoroughly, and none of these actions were mentioned, until they were. On my 10th day, I arrived for my evening shift and found the other ushers huddled in the break room, speaking in hushed tones that ceased immediately when I entered. Thomas had a fresh cut across his forehead. Vivian's hands were bandaged. Parker was rocking slightly in his chair, eyes fixed on a water stain on the ceiling that vaguely resembled a screaming face. "What happened?" I asked. "Matinee incident," Thomas replied curtly. "Nothing to worry about." That evening, I opened the guidebook to review the closing procedures and discovered additional rules written on what I could have sworn were previously blank pages. The ink glistened as if still wet, though it didn't smudge when I ran my finger across it. The handwriting was jittery, urgent, as if scrawled in haste or fear. When walking from the projection booth, count your steps. If the number doesn't match your previous count, return to the booth immediately. Never enter the projection room during a film showing unless expressly instructed by Mr. Harrington. If you see a patron wearing a blue carnation, do not make eye contact and inform Mr. Harrington immediately. Count the number of people entering Theatre 3. Recount when they exit. Report any discrepancies. Theatre 5 does not exist. If a patron asks about Theatre 5, direct them to Mr. Harrington. The women's restroom on the second floor must remain locked between 3:15 to 3:45 p.m. If a film appears to run backward, do not adjust the projector. Evacuate the theatre quietly. Popcorn left under seats overnight must be collected wearing gloves and burned, not discarded. Children crying in the lobby after 10 p.m. are not actually children. If you hear your name called from inside a dark theatre, do not respond and do not enter alone. The drinking fountain near Theatre 3 dispenses water only on Mondays, Wednesdays and Saturdays. On other days, the liquid is not water. Should you notice a patron remaining perfectly still throughout an entire showing, not blinking, not breathing, report to management after they exit. That last entry about the second floor restroom confused me most of all. The theatre didn't have a second floor, or at least I thought it didn't. That night I had trouble sleeping. Dreams of endless theatre corridors plagued me. Dreams where I was both the audience and the unwilling performer in a play where I didn't know my lines. I woke repeatedly, once to find my uniform vest hanging on my bedroom door, though I was certain I'd left it in my locker at the theatre. The following day I arrived early for my shift, determined to explore the building more thoroughly. The Majestic seemed different in daylight, smaller somehow, the ornate details less impressive, and more decayed. As I passed the main office, I heard Mr. Harrington speaking to someone, his tone uncharacteristically emotional. "The boundary is thinning again," he was saying. "We can't contain it much longer without another offering." A voice responded, deep, resonant, with an accent I couldn't place. "The theatre has chosen a new guardian. The transfer must begin soon." I moved quickly past the door before I could be discovered eavesdropping. My heart was racing as I retreated to the lobby, pretending to organise concession items until my shift officially began. Later that evening, I discovered a narrow staircase hidden behind what I'd always assumed was a supply closet. The door had always been locked before, but now it swung open at my touch, revealing worn steps that spiralled upward. The stone stairs were worn in the centre, suggesting frequent use over many years, yet covered in dust as if rarely traversed. Handprints were visible in the dust, some human-sized, others disturbingly large or with too many fingers. At the top was a long corridor with several doors on either side. The hallway stretched much farther than the building's exterior dimensions should allow. Wallpaper peeled in long strips like flayed skin, revealing underneath not plaster but something that pulsed slightly, as if breathing. Doors lined both sides, some normal-sized, others barely large enough for a child, and one so tall and narrow it could only accommodate someone inhumanly proportioned. One door was marked women's restroom in faded gilt letters. I checked my watch, 3:16 p.m. The door was locked, just as the guidebook instructed. As I stood there, I heard something from behind it, a slow, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails on porcelain, then a sound like water dripping, but heavier, more viscous. I placed my ear against the door and immediately recoiled. The door was warm, like fevered skin, and seemed to pulse against my touch. I hurried back downstairs, nearly falling in my haste, unsettled by the discovery. When I casually asked Thomas about the second floor, he paled visibly, a tremor developing in his left eye. "We don't go up there unless necessary," he said quietly, glancing nervously at the ceiling. "And never ever unlock that bathroom door during the forbidden time." "Why? What happens?" He simply tapped the guidebook in my hand, his finger leaving a smudge that looked suspiciously like blood. "The rules exist for a reason." That evening, I was assigned to Theatre 3 for the 7:30 showing of an obscure Italian horror film from the 1970s. As I tore tickets, I noticed something odd. Each ticket showed a different film title, though all patrons were clearly entering the same theatre. When I mentioned this to Parker, who was working concessions, he smiled strangely. "Everyone sees what they need to see," he whispered. "The Majestic knows what you fear." That night, I began noticing what I would come to call the regulars, patrons with bizarre behaviours who attended screenings with unsettling frequency. Over the coming weeks, I would catalogue their appearances in a small notebook I kept hidden in my apartment, under my mattress where the dreams couldn't reach it. There was an elderly couple who always reserved seats A12 and A13 for the 7:30 showing. They wore formal attire from another era, he in a three-piece suit with pocket watch, she in gloves and a pillbox hat with a thin veil. Throughout the entire film, they would sit perfectly still, never watching the screen, their eyes fixed instead on the emergency exit door. Their skin had a waxy quality that reflected the screen's light oddly, and I never once saw either of them blink or breathe. I made the mistake of addressing them directly once. "Enjoying the film?" I asked during my routine check of the theatre. They turned to me in perfect unison, their heads rotating too far to be natural. Their smiles were identical, too wide, revealing teeth that appeared filed to points. "We're not here for the film, young man," the woman said, her voice containing an echo, though the theatre's acoustics shouldn't have allowed it. "We're here for what comes after," the man continued, his voice identical to hers in pitch and cadence. I stammered something about enjoying the show and fled to the lobby, where I found Mr. Harrington waiting, a knowing look on his face. "The Westbrooks have been attending since opening night," he said, "though they died in 1963. Another regular was a tall figure in a long coat who would purchase a ticket for every showing, but never actually enter any theatre. They would simply stand in the corner of the lobby, face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, occasionally checking a pocket watch that glowed with an unnatural blue light. The figure's height was inconsistent, sometimes merely tall, other times so towering its hat nearly brushed the lobby ceiling. Vivian called this patron the timekeeper and would grow anxious whenever it appeared. "It's marking when the barrier's thin," she told me once. "When that watch glows green instead of blue, we'll need to run." There was a group of teenagers who appeared every Wednesday, 5 of them wearing letter jackets from the local high school, laughing too loudly and moving with an unsettling synchronization. Their features were strangely blurred, as if poorly photographed, and their voices contained metallic undertones. According to Thomas, they had died in a car accident in 1987 after leaving a showing at the Majestic. "They don't know they're dead," he explained. "Don't ever tell them." Most disturbing was the woman who brought a covered bird cage to every midnight showing. Middle-aged with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, wearing an immaculate white dress regardless of season or weather. The cage was always draped with dark velvet, concealing its contents, but sometimes I could hear scratching from within, a sound no bird would make. Occasionally I caught glimpses of what appeared to be tiny human hands, pressing against the fabric from inside. Once, while helping her find her seat, always K7, directly beneath a particularly ornate ceiling fixture, I asked about her pet. Her smile was pleasant, but her eyes remained cold. "Oh, it's not a pet, dear boy. It's my baby." She leaned closer, her breath smelling of mothballs and something metallic. "Would you like to see? He performs the most delightful tricks when he's hungry." Her fingers moved toward the velvet covering. Mr. Harrington appeared seemingly from nowhere, placing himself between us. "Mrs. Lowell, how lovely to see you again. Your usual refreshments await you." He shot me a warning glance, and I retreated to the lobby, shaken. "Never ask to see inside the cage," he reprimanded me later. "Some things, once seen, cannot be unseen, and Mrs. Lowell's baby has been dead for over 40 years. As weeks passed, I began noticing discrepancies in our ticket counts. Theatre 3 was particularly problematic, often having 2 or 3 more people exit than had entered. These extras would appear perfectly normal at first glance, ordinary patrons discussing the film or checking their phones as they left. But closer observation revealed disturbing details. Their movements would be slightly wrong, too fluid or too jerky. Their faces often resembled those of actual patrons who had entered other theatres but hadn't yet exited, and they cast no reflections in the lobby mirrors. One evening, the count was particularly off. 17 people entered for the 9 p.m. showing, but 23 exited. The extras moved in perfect unison, forming a precise formation as they crossed the lobby. None spoke or interacted with anything. They exited through the main doors into the night, where I observed them from the window, walking in their perfect formation down the middle of the empty street until they vanished into the fog several blocks away. When I reported these discrepancies to Mr. Harrington, he simply nodded, as if expecting the news. "Keep counting," was all he said, "and never follow them if they leave in groups of more than 4. They're scouting for new territory." Over time, I devised a system to identify these extras more easily. The genuine patrons had warmth, both emotional and physical. The others maintained a perfect body temperature of exactly 78 degrees. Their expressions changed only when observed directly, and they always took precisely 17 steps from theatre exit to front door, regardless of their height or stride length. "What are they?" I asked Parker one quiet afternoon while we restocked concessions. He glanced nervously around before answering. "Echoes," he whispered, "from the other side of the screen. Sometimes what's shown isn't just images, it's a window, and occasionally things slip through from both directions." That night, I discovered a personal item, my college ID card, in a movie shown in Theatre 1, prominently displayed in a scene set in what was supposed to be 1940s Los Angeles. The actor picked it up, examined it closely enough that my face was clearly visible on screen, and then looked directly into the camera and winked. I nearly dropped my flashlight. That film had been made decades before I was born, let alone before I had that ID card made at the start of this semester. The next morning, I found the same ID card in my wallet, apparently untouched, but now when viewed from certain angles, the photo showed not my face but that of the actor who had held it on screen. My curiosity eventually overwhelmed my growing sense of dread. During a particularly slow Wednesday night showing of an obscure 1950s noir film, I broke one of the cardinal rules. I entered the projection room while a film was playing. The projectionist, an ancient man named Edwin, who communicated primarily through grunts and cryptic hand gestures, was nowhere to be seen. His absence itself was alarming. Edwin was notorious for never leaving his post during showings. His dedication was such that Thomas once claimed Edwin hadn't left the projection booth for more than 15 minutes at a time since 1972. The projection room was stifling hot, despite the rest of the building being uncomfortably cold that evening. The walls were covered with photographs of the Majestic throughout different eras, but in each image the audience's faces were carefully scratched out. Film reels lined the shelves, hundreds of them, their metal containers unmarked, except for dates and what appeared to be tallies of numbers. The projector was running, light streaming towards the small window overlooking the theatre below, but there was no film threaded through the mechanism. The supply reel and take-up reel stood completely empty, yet the machine whirred and clicked as if playing a full feature. Yet, peering through the window, I could clearly see images flickering on the screen below. More disturbingly, they weren't scenes from the noir film that should have been playing. Instead, the screen showed jerky, grainy footage of the theatre itself, empty seats from decades earlier based on their different design, occasionally populated by shadowy figures who moved in stilted, unnatural ways. As I watched, the perspective changed, as if the camera were moving through the aisles. It approached a solitary figure, seated in the centre of the theatre, a man in what appeared to be an usher's uniform from the 1960s based on the different cut and style. The camera moved closer until it was directly behind him, the usher's head tilted at an unnatural angle, nearly backwards, revealing a face I recognized with shock. It was Edwin, looking decades younger but unmistakable. The projection Edwin seemed to sense something. He turned further, his neck twisting beyond what should be physically possible, until he was looking directly at the camera, directly at me, from decades in the past. His mouth opened wider than humanly possible, revealing row upon row of teeth receding impossibly far into his throat. And then his face began to change, features melting and reforming into a visage I recognized with horror, my own face contorted in a silent scream. My blood ran cold when this figure suddenly looked up toward the projection booth, toward the real me. Its face a blurred smudge, except for a wide, too large smile that stretched literally from ear to ear. The projection room door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around to find Mr. Harrington standing there, his normally placid expression replaced with barely contained fury. His eyes had changed. The irises expanded until no white remained, the pupils elongated to vertical slits. "The rules exist for a reason," he hissed, white-gloved hands clenched into trembling fists. Was that not made abundantly clear? I stammered apologies, claiming I'd heard a strange noise and came to investigate. His anger dissipated almost instantly, replaced by an unnerving calm that was somehow more frightening than his rage. "Nothing was disturbed?" he asked, moving toward the still-running filmless projector. "No, sir. I only looked." He examined the machine carefully, running his gloved fingers along its surface in what appeared to be a caress. The projector seemed to respond to his touch, its mechanical whirring taking on a purring quality. "Good, very good. Return to your post and we'll say no more about this incident." As I moved toward the door, Mr. Harrington called after me. "Mr. Everett, the theatre sees everything, and it remembers." That night I dreamed I was a reel of film being fed through a massive projector, my skin peeling away as I passed through the mechanism, images of my life flickering and burning on a screen viewed by an audience of shadow figures whose applause sounded like the skittering of thousands of insects. But things changed after that night. The mysterious power outages began, brief blackouts that occurred precisely at 9:37 p.m. every third day. During these moments of darkness, I could hear whispers from empty theatres and footsteps from supposedly vacant hallways. Twice I found doors that had been locked, becoming unlocked, and once discovered all the concession candy arranged in elaborate spiral patterns when the lights returned. More disturbing were the changes to the films themselves. Regardless of what movie was scheduled, Certain scenes would appear that didn't belong, brief flashes of distorted faces, locations within the Majestic that didn't exist, and once a long sequence showing me sleeping in my apartment, filmed from the foot of my bed on a night I had been alone. The other staff began avoiding me. Thomas would cross himself whenever I entered a room. Vivian would recite something under her breath when forced to work alongside me. Parker was the only one who still spoke to me normally, though his trembling had worsened. "It selected you," he whispered during a quiet matinee. "Just like it selected me once, but I failed the test." He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a forearm covered in what appeared to be film sprocket holes punctured directly into his flesh. "Mr. Harrington will begin the preparation soon. When he offers you tea in his office, don't drink it." My curiosity now mixed with growing fear, I began researching the Majestic's history. The local library's archives revealed disturbing details. The theatre was built in 1927 on land previously occupied by a sanitarium that had burned down under mysterious circumstances. The architect had committed suicide immediately after the building's completion, leaving behind a note that simply read, "It isn't a theatre, it's a doorway." There had been mysterious disappearances associated with the venue throughout its history. Patrons who entered for showings but never returned home. Staff who vanished mid-shift. Police reports described searching the building thoroughly, only to find personal belongings in impossible locations. A woman's purse inside a sealed wall. A man's hat embedded within the concrete foundation, as if it had been there since construction. Most disturbing was the fire of 1958, which reportedly killed 6 people. Yet, photographs taken just days after the incident showed the building completely undamaged, with no sign of fire damage whatsoever. Newspaper accounts described the victims as having died from heat exposure, despite no evidence of burning on their bodies. Their eyes, according to the coroner's report, which had been heavily redacted, had been replaced with what appeared to be small film negatives showing images that could not be developed. And then there was Mr. Harrington. His name appeared in newspaper clippings dating back to the theatre's opening. While the quality of the older photos made absolute identification difficult, the figure in them bore a striking resemblance to my current employer, the same tall, gaunt frame and penetrating gaze. In none of the photos did he appear to have aged. I also discovered references to phantom screenings. Mysterious showings reported to play to empty theatres at 3:33 a.m, with strange lights and sounds emanating from the building, despite it being locked and empty. Local folklore spoke of people who claimed to have attended these screenings, only to find themselves unable to remember the films they had seen, though many reported recurring nightmares of being trapped inside a screen, pounding on the inside of the film as an audience watched impassively. When I returned to work following my research, I found new rules had appeared in the guidebook, written in what appeared to be fresh ink, but not ink at all. When I touched it, rather something tacky and copper-scented. Don't acknowledge the child selling tickets at the concession stand. If film appears to be running backward, evacuate Theatre 2 immediately. Count the doors when opening, count again when closing. If you hear humming from behind the screen, leave the building immediately and return at dawn. Never allow the 10:17 p.m. showing to extend past midnight. If you see yourself seated in the audience, do not approach your duplicate. Should the ceiling appear to breathe, remain perfectly still until it exhales fully. The shadows in Theatre 4 move independently of their casters. This is normal. If a patron purchases exactly 33 pieces of candy, contact Mr. Harrington before completing the transaction. Should you begin to hear the film audio when not in a theatre, cover your ears and recite your employee ID number backward. That night, I observed an elderly patron enter Theatre 2 for the 7 p.m. showing. What caught my attention was that he purchased a ticket for The Placeholder, a title not on our schedule. Stranger still, the ticket he handed me was dated 1947, yet appeared pristine. the ink still glistening. "It's finally my turn," he told me, his voice containing an echo despite the crowded lobby. "I've been waiting since I was first cast." I wanted to question him further, but the line behind him was growing. By the time I went to check Theatre 2 during my rounds, the man was nowhere to be seen, though his coat remained draped over the seat, slowly dissolving into a puddle of celluloid that dripped through the floorboards. The next day, Thomas failed to show up for his shift. Mr. Harrington simply said he had moved on, but Thomas's locker remained untouched, his half-eaten sandwich still inside. The apple he'd left had rotted in a matter of hours, the decay forming a pattern that resembled Thomas's screaming face. Vivian and Parker began acting strangely, their movements becoming mechanical, their conversations reduced to repeating the same phrases over and over, like actors who only knew a few lines. The show must continue. Patrons must be satisfied. The final reel is most important. The theatre sees all. Flickering is temporary. Film is forever. I began seeing them in places they shouldn't be. Parker standing motionless in darkened hallways. Vivian seated among the audience during screenings I knew she was supposed to be working. Most disturbing was catching glimpses of them on screen during films, their expressions frozen in silent screams at the edges of scenes in movies I knew they couldn't possibly be part of. Then the whispering began. Voices that emanated from the walls, from inside the popcorn machine, from beneath the cushions of theatre seats. They spoke in fragments, in multiple languages, sometimes in sounds that weren't quite language at all, but conveyed meaning nonetheless. Become the projector. The screen hungers. Your role is waiting. 3 more days until the premiere. The audience never leaves. It was while searching for a patron who had left behind an unusual antique pocket watch that I discovered the hidden schedule. The watch itself was strange. Its face showed not hours and minutes, but symbols I didn't recognize, and the second hand moved counterclockwise at varying speeds. When I brought it to the lost and found box, all the other items in the container immediately disintegrated into fine ash. Tucked between the wall and an antique filing cabinet in Mr. Harrington's office was a slim leather ledger, bound with what appeared to be skin too fine-grained to be from any livestock. It listed special screenings in a theatre simply labelled Omega. The entries dated back to 1927, each accompanied by a name and what appeared to be a time duration. Not of the film, I would later realise, but of how long the person survived the process. The next showing was scheduled for midnight on Friday, just 2 days away. The ledger page for that showing was blank, except for a name written in what appeared to be invisible ink that only became visible as my body heat warmed the page. Daniel Everett. My name. I tried to call in sick for my Friday shift, but discovered my phone would only connect to the theatre's number, regardless of which contact I selected. When I attempted to stay home, I found myself unable to remember where I lived. My memories of any location other than the Majestic becoming hazy and indistinct. Eventually, I found myself walking to work despite my conscious determination not to, my body moving of its own accord while my mind screamed in rebellion. Friday evening arrived with a strange atmosphere in the theatre. The regular patrons seemed agitated. The elderly couple actually turned to watch the screen for once. The tall figure paced the lobby, rather than standing still, and the woman with the birdcage was absent entirely. In her usual seat sat a child-sized mannequin that slowly turned its head to follow my movements across the theatre. The air itself felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. The walls pulsed subtly, as if breathing. The concessions began to spoil before customers' eyes, popcorn transforming into writhing masses of pale larvae, soda carbonating with such violence that the bubbles formed screaming faces before bursting. Yet, none of the patrons seemed alarmed. They accepted these phenomena with vacant smiles, their eyes increasingly filming over with what looked like thin sheets of celluloid. Shortly before midnight, I observed Mr. Harrington leading a group of about 15 people through a door in the far corner of the lobby. A door I was certain hadn't existed before. It had no handle, no hinges, simply a rectangular outline that irised open like a camera aperture as he approached. The patrons moved in eerie unison, their faces blank but eager, like sleepwalkers approaching a feast. I followed at a distance, slipping through the door just before it closed. Beyond was a curving corridor that seemed to spiral downward, though the building's foundation shouldn't have allowed for such a structure. The walls were lined with film reels mounted like trophies, each labelled with dates and what appeared to be names. As I passed, I saw Thomas's name on a freshly mounted reel. The film strip visible on its edge showed a single frame. His terrified eye widened in an eternal moment of horror. The air grew increasingly hot and thick as we descended, carrying the smell of chemicals and something organic beneath it. The scent of meat left too long in the sun. The sounds of the projector grew louder with each step, the distinctive clickety-clack of film feeding through the mechanism, but slowed down and somehow wet as if passing through liquid rather than air. The corridor opened into a theatre that defied architectural possibility, far larger than the Majestic itself, with rows of seats stretching into shadow-shrouded distances. The ceiling arched so high it disappeared into darkness, occasionally illuminated by flashes of what appeared to be heat lightning. The seats themselves were wrong organic looking, pulsing slightly, the cushions textured like skin, with occasional patches of what appeared to be hair or fingernails. The screen was enormous, its surface not the usual white, but a shifting, rippling black that reminded me of liquid mercury. It didn't hang flat but curved inward like a massive concave eye, its surface occasionally bulging outward as if something behind it was trying to push through. The patrons were already seated, arranged in a perfect semicircle, despite the hundreds of available seats. Upon closer inspection, I realized many weren't patrons at all, but things merely wearing the appearance of humanity, like ill-fitting suits, their proportions subtly wrong, their features fluid and unfixed. Mr. Harrington stood before the screen, his white gloves practically glowing in the darkness. He had removed his usual vest, revealing a shirt that appeared to be fastened not with buttons, but with small mechanical apertures that dilated and contracted like camera shutters, offering glimpses of what lay beneath. Not flesh, but spinning reels and celluloid strips where organs should be. "Tonight's viewing will commence," he announced in a voice that echoed strangely. "Please remember to keep your eyes open at all times. What you blink away cannot be unseen." He turned towards the screen, raised his hands, and the surface began to ripple more violently, before settling into an image. Not a traditional film, but something that resembled a live feed, from multiple locations simultaneously, all bleeding into one another. I watched in horror as the scenes depicted what appeared to be real deaths and impossible places, landscapes where physics seemed optional, structures that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, and worse, people I recognized, former employees according to their uniforms, performing disturbing rituals or frozen in moments of terror. One sequence showed a woman in what I recognized as the 1940s version of the Majestic's Usher uniform, slowly dissolving from the edges inward, her mouth open in a silent scream as her outer layers peeled away like film emulsion, exposed to extreme heat. Another depicted a man being fed through what appeared to be a massive projector, his body flattening and fragmenting into individual frames that continued to move and struggle independently. Most shocking was seeing Thomas among them, his expression one of rapturous agony as he repetitively climbed a staircase that led nowhere, his movements becoming less human with each cycle. His skin had taken on the sepia tone of aged film, his joints moving with the slight stutter of stop-motion animation. As I watched, his features became increasingly indistinct, his identity dissolving into the role he now played eternally. A hand gripped my shoulder. I turned to find Mr. Harrington beside me, though I hadn't seen or heard him approach. His face had changed, features rearranging themselves into new configurations as I watched, as if I was seeing multiple exposures of different faces overlaid on a single negative. Curious ushers often find themselves part of the feature presentation, he said softly, his voice modulating between registers. But perhaps you're here for a greater purpose. He led me to a small anteroom behind the theatre where film reels lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each one gently pulsing with a soft light and emitting barely audible whispers. Some were ancient wooden spools, others modern plastic, but all moved slightly, rotating at different speeds, as if being played by invisible projectors. The Majestic exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously, he explained, removing his gloves to reveal hands that weren't hands at all, but something like film negative, black where flesh should be, transparent in places, revealing mechanical workings beneath. His fingers extended and retracted like camera lenses focusing, the joints bending in impossible directions. We exist at the intersection of realities, he continued, gesturing to the main theatre. Some of our patrons are entities that feed on human emotions. During screenings, the rules exist to maintain balance between worlds, to ensure that what passes through the screen passes in the correct direction. He reached towards a nearby reel, caressing it tenderly. The reel trembled at his touch, the whispers emanating from it becoming momentarily louder, a voice pleading for release. Each contains a soul, you might say. Former employees, mostly. Their essence helps maintain the boundaries. He tapped the reel, and a fragment of image projected momentarily from it onto the wall, a mouth forming the words, "Help me." What boundaries? I managed to ask, my voice strange to my own ears, as if I were hearing it play back on damaged speakers. Between what is and what wishes to be. He pointed to the largest reel, mounted at the centre of the wall. Unlike the others, this one was perfectly still, its surface a matte black that seemed to absorb all light around it. This theatre serves as a prison for something ancient, something that was here long before humans built anything atop its resting place. It dreams of freedom, and those dreams manifest as images, films that should never be seen. The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost formed on my eyelashes as Mr. Harrington approached me, his movements becoming increasingly jerky and mechanical. It was imprisoned by the first people who settled this land, bound with rituals and symbols that your modern world has forgotten, but it adapted. As humans created new technologies, new methods of storytelling, it learned to use them. He gestured around us. First magic lanterns, then kinetoscopes, finally motion pictures, the perfect medium for its purposes. He turned to me, his eyes now resembling film sprocket holes, perfectly rectangular voids that somehow still conveyed emotion. Behind them I could see what appeared to be film, running continuously, showing scenes I couldn't quite make out. I've maintained the Majestic for over a century. I was not the first guardian, nor will I be the last. The theatre chose you just as it once chose me. His voice had taken on the quality of old film, audio scratchy, with pops and hisses between words. Before me was Eleanor Wainwright, who served for 67 years. Before her, Jonathan Blackman, for 43. The first was Willem Muller, who built the original structure in 1901. Understanding dawned horribly. You want me to take your place? Want is irrelevant. It's necessity. The projector must always have an operator. The films must continue to play. His form flickered briefly, revealing a skeletal frame, made not of bone, but of metal rods and gears. I am failing. The mechanisms wear down eventually, even with replacements and repairs. He handed me the guidebook, now considerably thicker than when I'd first received it. The cover pulsed slightly, like a heartbeat. When I took it, the leather felt warm and slightly damp, as if freshly harvested. "The final rule," he said, "is that the final screening must never end. As long as it plays, what's trapped remains trapped." He gestured towards the massive screen visible through the doorway, where Thomas's form continued its endless climbing, now barely recognizable as human, more a collection of film artifacts and visual noise, roughly arranged in human shape. Each operator chooses their successor. The theatre suggests candidates, but the final choice is mine. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and I felt a cold sensation spread from the point of contact. Not the cold of winter, but the absence of all heat. The entropic cold of deep space. "You have the correct qualities, sensitivity to the boundaries, an understanding of narrative and image that the theatre finds appealing." The flesh around his collar had begun to peel away like old wallpaper, revealing not bone or muscle, but what appeared to be film reels and gears, spinning and clicking with precise mechanical movements. "And if I refuse?" A terrible smile spread across his face, stretching wider than any human mouth could. "No one refuses. Thomas tried. See how well that ended for him." He gestured towards the screen visible through the doorway. The theatre always finds a way to incorporate rejection into the narrative. You become part of the collection either way, as guardian or as exhibit. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the increasingly loud mechanical clicking emanating from within Mr. Harrington's disintegrating form. "Until you find your own replacement. For some, decades. For others, centuries." A panel in his chest swung open like a projector-loading door, revealing not organs but interlocking gears and spinning reels of film that appeared to be made of something organic. "The theatre provides everything you need. Your body will be modified to serve its function more efficiently." Through the doorway, I could see the audience in the theatre had changed. They no longer resembled humans at all, but were masses of celluloid and mechanical parts roughly arranged in human shapes, their features flickering between different faces like rapidly changing film frames. They had begun to sway in unison, a low humming emanating from them that made my teeth vibrate. I looked down at the guidebook in my hands, at Mr. Harrington's inhuman face, at the soul-containing film reels surrounding us, and made the only choice I could. That was 6 months ago. "Rule," he said, "is that the final screening must never end. As long as it plays, what's trapped remains trapped. And if I refuse?" A terrible smile spread across his face. "No one refuses. Thomas tried. See how well that ended for him." He gestured towards the screen visible through the doorway, where Thomas's form continued its endless climbing, now barely recognizable as human. "The choice is simple. Become the new guardian or become part of the collection." I looked down at the guidebook in my hands, at Mr. Harrington's inhuman face, at the soul-containing film reels surrounding us, and made the only choice I could. That was 6 months ago. The transition wasn't painful exactly. My skin has grown paler, sensitive to sunlight. My hands are changing, becoming more like Mr. Harrington's former appendages. I've written many new rules in the guidebook, as I've discovered them necessary. If the popcorn machine runs without being turned on, serve no concessions that day. Tickets torn completely in half must be burned immediately. When the clock runs backward, do not acknowledge it. If a patron asks to see what's really playing, direct them to Theatre Omega. I watch new ushers being hired, knowing their likely fate. Some will become like Thomas, Parker and Vivian, fragments of themselves projected onto the screen, or wandering the theatre in mechanical imitation of life. Perhaps one eventually will take my place as guardian. The Majestic must always have its staff. The projector must always run. The film must never end. So, If you visit an old cinema someday, one with ornate fixtures and oddly specific rules, pay close attention to the ushers in their crimson vests. Notice how they count their steps, how they knock before entering doorways, how they never quite meet your eyes. And whatever you do, don't stay for the midnight showing. The rules exist for a reason.